Ricominciamo i lavori, sempre parlando dei barbari, sempre parlando di dati archeologici. Il primo relatore sarà von-rummel dell'Universitat di Friburgo, dunque proveniente dalla famosa scuola di Friburgo di Heiko Steuer, Sebastian Brata. Purtroppo Sebastian Brata stesso non poteva venire. E anche von-rummel, come Irene Barbiera prima, sa lavorare sia con fonti scritte sia con dati archeologici. Ci parlerà dell'archeologia dei barbari in Africa.
Ladies and gentlemen, first I want to excuse me speaking English, but I think it's better for you and for me. To speak about the archaeology of barbarians in North Africa in a 20-minute paper is a quite risky enterprise, if not impossible at all. However, it is important, in my opinion, not to focus on the Vandals alone, but to look to the Moors as well. Even so, the Moors played a neglected role in modern research. Their influence on 5th century North Africa was not less than the one of the Vandals. In a very short overview, I will thus go into three main questions. First, what was the influence of barbarians on the development of 5th century Roman North Africa? Secondly, are these influences visible by archaeological means? And finally, was the 5th century a period of definitive change and a historical break in North Africa's way from antiquity to the Middle Ages? To measure barbarian influence, we need a definition of what was barbarian and what was not. As we all know, such a definition is more complex than traditional views tried to demonstrate. Here, an example from a German book. The fluidity and the ambiguity of both terms, Romans as well as barbarian, poses a challenge to archaeologists who want to find barbarian traces. By all means, it is too easy to connect every ruin, every layer of rubble, and every jewel made by an unskilled craftsman to barbarians, and to ascribe mosaics, baths, and beautiful finds to Romans. Both terms, Roman and barbarian, operate on levels other than material culture. They are no a priori helpful categories for archaeologists. As to migrating groups like the Vandals, terms like new and traditional or local and foreign can help to describe differences in material culture brought by the immigrants. However, if the relevant people did always live in the region under study, and if the local culture is theirs, as it is the case with most groups of African Moors, the archaeological potential to contribute to the question of barbarians and change is very limited. In this case, it is just possible to study long-term change in the relevant region and to compare this evidence with other examples. In this way, archaeology is able to reveal traces of change. In which way barbarians were responsible for this change is a matter of discussion in each particular case. One of the 5th century events that was undoubtedly a barbarian act was the Vandal conquest of North Africa. This may be a good starting point for the search for barbarian influence on change in the 5th century. When Vandal troops conquered Africa in 429 AD, they came into a region never before touched by invasions of European barbarians. The written sources, above all Victor of Vita, create the picture of a catastrophic event with masses of victims, ruined landscapes, and refugees flooding into Italy and the eastern provinces. The sources describe a real clash between a foreign army and the untouched culture of late Roman Africa. This raised hopes of being able to identify the invaders and parts of their cultural heritage through objects foreign to North Africa but similar to European finds. But up to now, the quest for such groups of materials has been to no avail. It is not possible to attribute to the Vandals any particular type of finds that might be connected to the area of origin of the Vandals, in particular the so-called Przeworsk culture in Poland, often understood as having been Vandal. There are no ceramics, no specific house forms, and no other manifestation of material culture that could be distinguished by archaeological means from the late Roman African sphere. As in other regions, hopes for a distinction between Roman and Germanic have therefore focused on grave finds, considered as a useful source of information on burial culture as well as on clothing and dress conserved in these graves. Here, an example from Tuburbo Maius in Tunisia, with 2 furnished burials from the church in the ancient temple of Baal Tanit. The tomb of Arifridus, with a famous fibula and 3 buckles. This fibula and these buckles. This third one is not on the picture. And the tomb of a woman, these are the other finds, with 2 golden fibulae, golden plates from the costume, a pair of earrings and glass pearls. However, as here in Tuburbo Maius, the finds brought to light in those North African graves show neither Germanic nor other ethnic signs. This is also true for the grave of Carthage Kudiat Asatr. With its famous pair of bow fibulae with cloisonné decoration, a single armbrust fibula, a belt buckle that was formerly known as a Hunnic type, a chain, finger rings, golden appliques of the dress, and golden threads woven into an unknown kind of textile. These finds do not belong to a typical Vandal or East Germanic costume. They rather represent a supra-regional fashion than a national costume, a fashion that was modern and new, partly connected to the military service, partly influenced by Eastern elements. These costumes are un-Roman from a certain point of view and Roman at the same time. Just as the burial ritual with abundant provisions for the dead that shows a marked contrast to the great majority of North African graves that only rarely carry burial offerings, the costume found in these graves are part of the efforts of representation of a new, powerful elite. This is not a particular phenomenon of North Africa, but can be observed on the Iberian Peninsula, in Italy, or in Gaul as well. Besides, and in short, this is also true for the famous Vandal horseman from Carthage, who may have been a Vandal, but who looks like every other landowner in hunting dress of this period. In other areas of everyday material culture that we already know of, the immigrant army of Vandals relied entirely on existing local resources, so that the mass of African Vandals seems to stay out of reach for archaeological research. Only in a very special cases may we distinguish between Roman and Vandal influence on the basis of epigraphy and of a few graves. Instead of focusing attention on those minor differences, it is worth emphasizing that in North Africa, no specific cultural identity of the Vandals can be established through their material legacy. From the archaeological point of view, this result may be disappointing. Advocates of the traditional ethnic ascription theory may ask how we can talk at all about the Vandals from an archaeological point of view if we are not able to distinguish them from the indigenous population. Disappointment is, however, not appropriate. Instead of a more and more desperate search of ethnicity-carrying artifacts, we should rather raise the question why the immigrants rest almost invisible. As to the Vandal settlement in Africa, there is no single house or villa where a Vandal owner can be determined. Some colleagues think that there still are hidden Germanic villages and corresponding cemeteries to discover in the African soil. Personally, I cannot share this hope, as neither the recent archaeological surveys in rural areas nor any of the urban excavations have brought forward a single clue. It seems more helpful to look to written sources, where Procopius, Laxorius, or the unknown Aryan writer Pseudo-Origenes tell us about rich estates in the countryside and urban houses of Vandals as well. This is why the widespread opinion that Vandals just lived in the countryside is not very convincing. In this map, I collected the finds for which archaeologists discuss if they are Vandal or not. Comparing this map with a map of Courtois that was brought up to date recently by Yves Modérand, indicating all places in which a Vandal presence can be inferred from literary or epigraphic sources, it becomes clear that most of the evidences originates from towns. Furthermore, the map shows a concentration of Vandal activities in the region of the proconsular province. The Vandals represented the new elite of this region. Therefore, I see no reason to expect and to argue with arcane, still hidden wooden villages in a Middle European style, which were used as base camps for vandalism against the urban culture of Roman North Africa. We speak of a region where the urban centers were still, as in preceding times, inseparable from the rural hinterland. Above all, in the Proconsularis, with its dense network of towns, where according to Victor of Vita, the majority of the Vandals settled, some towns served right into late antiquity as residence and administrative centers for landowners and their agricultural activities, although the existence of Vandal-era villae is beyond doubt, evidenced by written records as well as archaeological research. Most of the rich landowners probably had, as did the Vandal king, urban residences and rural villa at the same time. Recent studies in late antique urbanism and economy in North Africa show clearly that there is no considerable impact of Vandal actions on urbanism, neither in a positive nor in a negative way. As the studies of Claude Lepellet demonstrate, the decline of urban activities visible in inscriptions start already in the late 4th century and continues under Vandal rule. The Vandal conquest was no significant break in this respect. In the first half of the 5th century, none of the areas of material culture shows a break that could be related to the politically crucial occurrence of the Vandal conquest. On the contrary, some archaeologists speak of the Vandal period as a splendid time of the African towns, after finds of prospering urban quarters in Carthage, Tobodomaios, Naboe, and other mainly coastal towns. Some scholars even thought of a positive Vandal reorganization of economy, production, and trade. However, that phenomenon seems not to date into the Vandal, but rather into the early Byzantine period. As to the Vandal period, ceramic analysis still shows a busy exchange with most parts of the Mediterranean. Vandal rule brought no economic boom to North Africa, but the Vandals, in collaboration with the local administration, managed to maintain the former standards of production and distribution, which is, in my opinion, an important point. For all that positive signs, archaeology cannot conceal the fact that there are undeniable signs of decline at many places, above all in the rural hinterland. In the northern Tunisian Oued Khalet, for example, a heavy decay has to be stated for the 5th century. In this region, a decline in the number of rural settlements goes along with the process of ruralization of formerly wealthy towns, like this example in Duga. But this again can hardly be connected with the Vandals, as decline and transformation begin long before the Vandal conquest, continue throughout the years of the Vandal rule, and do not cease even after the Byzantine conquest. I show you here an example from my own excavation in Duga, where we can see in almost every public places layers of rubble and giving up of public places already in the 4th century. Nevertheless, the Vandal kings reigned in the African provinces for more than a century and considerably influenced their destiny. At the outset, we are surprised by the lack of those traces that one would normally expect to discover. After a while, we must acknowledge that the lack of traces has its reason too. At the time of the invasion of Africa, the immigrant army was already Romanized to such a degree and demonstrated such a great adaptability that the late antique material culture of North Africa was also theirs. The traces left by the Vandals in Africa are so slight, and continuity, like here in Hippo Regius, in the positive as in the negative way, is so predominant that one must say that without written sources, inscriptions and coins, which can clearly be attributed to the Vandals, one would not suspect a decisive historical break in the second third of the 5th century, nor a conquest of Africa by a barbarian army. As to the Moors, the judgment on their influence on change is considerably more difficult than in case of the Vandals. There are indeed expanding Moorish groups coming from the desert to the regions in today's Tunisia and Algeria, like the famous Laguatan, for example, that did, as Yves Monderon has shown, not migrate as it's shown here in this map, but came from the Sirte region and Tripolitania. However, the bulk of the Moors that appear in the written sources did not migrate. Their ancestors have always been part of Roman North Africa. Distinguishing them from Romans is therefore not easy. As in other provinces, many pre-Roman aspects of daily life persisted into the Roman period. Probably the most famous example are local ceramics. Our excavation in Duga, for instance, reveals quite similar pottery from pre-Roman layers through the whole Roman period and in early medieval units as well. The late French archaeologist Gabriel Combe describes this African handmade pottery as, I quote, living symbol of technical conservatism, unquote. From Combe's point of view, these ceramics are an example of the Berber permanence and of long-lived cultural traditions of indigenous North Africa. However, handmade pottery is actually present in every excavated settlement in North Africa, even in big cities like Carthage. This shows in a remarkable way that pre-Roman aspects of material culture survived even in the most Romanized centers without making the citizens of these places less Roman than others. This is, of course, also true the other way around. A Roman layout of a farm or the use of African red slipware says nothing about the ethnic or political identity of people. But nevertheless, or perhaps exactly for this reason, Moorish influence on change seems to have been stronger than that of the Vandals. During the 5th century, almost all formerly Roman territories outside the Vandal kingdom came under the rule of independent Moorish leaders. The famous inscription from Altava of Masuna, Rex Gentium Maurorum et Romanorum, and other mentions of different kings and princes explains in how many parts Roman Africa had disintegrated in the course of the 5th century. Those Moorish kings built impressive funeral monuments, the Jeddas in Algeria, for example. These monuments play together with the mausoleum of Theodoric in Ravenna in the Champions League of barbarian monuments of this period, and remind us in an impressive way that Germanic tribes were not the only key figures in the transformation of the late Roman world. The architectural form of these monuments echoes a long tradition of massive North African mausolea, stretching back to Numidian kingdoms of the pre-Roman period. The Jeddas could thus be considered the ultimate development of an indigenous funerary architectural tradition adapted to fit a Christian, Romanized environment. However, apart from these prominent monuments, it is very difficult to separate Moors from Romans and from Vandals. It is thus complicated to evaluate their particular influence on 5th century Africa. To demonstrate this, I will go into a region that is located in the southwestern part of the ancient province of Byzacena, near the frontier of present-day Tunisia and Algeria. There, in the later Vandal period, a formerly insignificant tribal group under the leadership of a certain Gwenfan and his son Antalas became one of the most powerful factions in the territory of Vandal and later Byzantine Africa. This group, called Frexes, lived in the mountains west of the route from Teveste in today's Algeria via Telept in Tunisia and to the oasis of Gafsa. This localization may be surprising. The barbarians lived in a region that had belonged until then to the civilized or Roman parts of North Africa. Nearby, the so-called Ostraka of Birtrush were found in the Wad al-Mitta in 1965. 5 inscribed potsherds, which served as a receipts of payments in agricultural products and were dated in regnal years of the Vandal king Guntermund. Moreover, the famous Albertini tablets, a set of archival documents inscribed on wooden tablets dating from the late 5th century, and singular proof of the continuity of Roman tenure system from the 1st century AD into the Vandal period, come from Jebel Mrata, a mountainous region near the frontier of Algeria and Tunisia. This means that the inhabitants of the Fundi mentioned in the tablets were not only contemporaries, but also almost neighbors of Antalas' father Gwenfan, the barbarian leader. Despite this geographical vicinity, the Frexes were, following Procopius and Corippus, ideologically clearly in opposition to Romans and Vandals. This, however, again begs the question of who the Romans were in this period and in this region. If we believe the view of Christian Courtois that the African Romania was mainly an urbanized civilization, we are certainly able to trace differences between the inhabitants of Roman towns and the Moorish peasants of the hinterland. However, as it becomes apparent in the written sources, the Moorish Frexes were probably a settled community. Their way of life may thus not have been very different from people living on Roman estates, the latter perfectly integrated into the fiscal, legal, and economic mechanisms of the late Roman and the Vandal state. Language could have been one of the signs of Moorish identity. From Corippus, we hear about the Moors in Antalas' camp that they consulted in a broken and ugly tongue with baying and fizzling sounds. Therefore, it seems probable that the Moors of Antalas spoke a local Libyan Berber dialect. This native language was a usual idiom in 5th century North Africa, and related dialects are still to be found in our days in many parts of North Africa. Augustine, Jerome, and Procopius confirm the survival of a Punic language. However, the Punic language to which Augustine refers is probably not the Punic of ancient Carthage, but the Libyan Berber dialect of Augustine's Numidian homelands. As it is evident that even in a very Romanized region, like Augustine's diocese of Hippo Regius, the late Roman society was largely bilingual. This situation can also be assumed for other regions further in the south. As Libyan dialects were probably spoken so far into late Roman North Africa, language seems to be of little practical use for the distinctions of Romans and Moors. Besides, tribal organization and clanship seem to have been among the important factors of social identity. Although the successful Roman system of land management integrated a considerable part of Africans into a kind of Roman identity, many tribes seem to have persisted through the empire, particularly in Tripolitania, Numidia, and Mauritania, but also in the south of the later Byzacena. It seems thus that a significant late antique revival of tribal structures was probably based on existing older structures. Other important distinguishing features are clothing, hairstyle, and body signs. Unfortunately, we know almost nothing about the physical appearance of Moors. This is basically due to the fact that pictorial representations and literary descriptions are rare, and archaeological finds of textiles and other clothing accessories not existing. Corippus tells of problems to identify friend and foe in battle. Thus, the differences between the Moorish and Roman soldiers cannot have been remarkable. Therefore, the discussion over costumes as distinguishing features, so predominant in the archaeology of other barbarian tribes, as we have seen, including the African Vandals, is dispensable in the case of the Moors. Unfortunately, the state of archaeological research in the high steppe west of the axis Tebessa-Gafsa is even not good. Even larger Roman towns in this region, like Telept, are almost unknown, apart from the visible ruins. Topographical surveys by the French military authority in the early days of the 20th century and their finds of numerous settlements and installations show that the homeland of the Phryxes was well Romanized in the preceding centuries, at least from the archaeological sources. Christianization is proven by findings of small churches and inscriptions of Christian character. Because of the aridity at the southern edge of the steppe belt, irrigation work was an important task. As Corippus speaks of a prospering region in Antalas' youth, we may suppose that the ancient economical and infrastructural base was still existing in the second half of the 5th century, but the system was very fragile. Regrettably, we have no real idea of the settlement pattern in this region. There are very Roman-looking complexes with regular ground plans, and amongst others, villages like this one near Kasserine, characterized by an irregular arrangement of building groups containing commercial sections as well as living quarters. The layout of such settlements may belong to surviving features of pre-Roman Africa. But finally, it is almost impossible to trace clear differences between the Moors and the people that lived in the same region some years before as Romans. It might thus be helpful to ask what happened in the southern regions of the Vandal kingdom in the late 5th century that could have been the reason for the appearance of new, formerly unknown entities. This leads us to the final question, if the 5th century really was a period of definitive change. What North Africa may show more clearly than other provinces of the Roman West is that the appraisal of the 5th century as a period of crisis or not depends heavily on the perspective of the observer. A clash of Roman and barbarian is not visible in the archaeological sources, neither in Vandal nor in Moorish context. Yet, some developments in North African society and economics in the 5th century are related to the Roman Empire's demise and the Vandal takeover. The changes at the high political level, the collapse of effective imperial government in the region, removed earlier means of ensuring standing in local society and compelled local elites to adopt new strategies. Imperial patronage was no longer available, and the Donatist Catholic controversy evaporated. In their stead came Vandal royal patronage and the Catholic Arian rivalry, and new economic opportunities were opened up for maximizing the rewards of local landholding. This had profound effects upon social structure and local political relationships, not the least for the formation of Moorish groups. What becomes more clear in the case of the Moors than the Vandals is a gradual decline of economy and a decrease in the number of rural settlements in the interior since the second half of the 5th century. This was recognized by Hitchner in the Kasserine survey and is paralleled by the results of the Libyan Valley survey. But it stands in clear contrast to the results of survey projects in the proconsular province further north, where a decline in the quantity of rural settlements generally seems to occur not until the late 6th or 7th century. From this, we may conclude that at least some regions in the south passed through turbulent times from the 5th century onwards. But what are the reasons for those problems? The most frequently mentioned explanations is the appearance of barbarians itself. Like in the north of the empire, Barbarian invasions are described as a major reason of late antique transformation. In this delineation, the immigration of the Vandals and of powerful tribes from the desert into the Roman provinces has caused a significant change in the regional political and social structure. However, this version does not apply to the case of tribes like the Phryxes that emerged in the Roman province itself. Most of the models to explain 5th century change in the south of Roman Africa base on the premise that the Moors caused the archaeologically visible economic decline. We should, however, consider the other way as well and think of the possibility that Moorization did not cause the decline, but was a result of it. Some activities of North African barbarians that appear to be actions against Rome may perhaps also be seen as a response to changing circumstances in which the Roman Empire ceased to be the best alternative. In search of the reasons of the growing insecurity, climatic change has often been seen as one of the central factors of transformation. Actually, some geomorphologic and paleobotanic studies suggest a climatic change to drier weather during the 5th and 6th century. But a recapitulating overview of the different methods and results of the reconstruction of North African climate in late antiquity does not exist up to now, and conclusions are sometimes contradictory. If it could be proven true that drier conditions took place in the course of the 5th century, this, perhaps, was one of the main reasons for the political and economic transformations in the now Moorish territories. A region that highly depends on careful water supply is extremely sensitive to climatic change. So, our knowledge of North African climate history is still too fragmentary to come to definitive conclusions. This is unfortunately also true for other aspects of life in late antique and early medieval southwestern Byzacena. Information is generally still too scanty for solid explanations. In this respect, intensified archaeological research in the Moorish homeland would not only expand our knowledge of the people who lived there, but also of the reasons that pushed them to become barbarians. To conclude, we can state that the complex but powerful concept of Rome, Latin language, Christian faith, towns, and supra-regional contexts survived the barbarians and the problems of the 5th century. Parts of Africa stayed Roman and became barbarian in the same time. Thus, the impact of barbarians on the transformation of the African Roman world is, from one point of view, immense, and from another position, irrelevant. It seems important to overcome the idea that Rome's Africa of the Severan period was an optimum through which each development and change can only be judged in a negative way. At the same time, it is not reasonable to take every Vandal period villa or mosaic as a proof of a golden age. In Africa, the 5th century was a period of slight but steady change. It was not the historical break and just one of a couple of steps on North Africa's way from antiquity to the Middle Ages. If there's any need to define this break more exactly, then there's a better chance to find it in the following, and particularly in the 7th century. Thank you very much.